Find somewhere comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day settle. Tonight we're going nowhere urgent and doing nothing that needs to be done. We're simply going to travel, slowly, gently, across 6 centuries and 3 continents, through a world of minarets and market stalls, of camel caravans at dusk, of candlelit palaces and quiet village hearths. The Ottoman Empire was one of the longest-lasting and most extraordinary civilizations in recorded history, and its story is vast enough to hold you all the way through the night. There is no rush here. Let the words move like smoke from a winter fire, unhurried, drifting upward, dissolving softly into something like sleep. Long before anyone had heard the name Ottoman, the land of Anatolia was already ancient beyond counting. It is a peninsula that juts westward from the great Asian continent, like the head of an animal peering out toward the sea. To the north lies the Black Sea, cold and deep and grey most of the year. To the south stretches the warm blue of the Mediterranean, where merchants and pirates have always competed for the same waves. To the west, across a narrow channel that takes only a few minutes to cross by boat, sits Europe, visible on clear days, close enough to tempt, far enough to seem foreign. For thousands of years, Anatolia had been a crossroads. The Hittites built their temples here. The Greeks established colonies along its shimmering western coasts and called this region Ionia, a name that still carries a kind of poetry. Persian armies marched through it. Alexander the Great swept across it in a matter of months, barely pausing. Rome made it a province and drained it of grain and marble, and then, slowly, with much difficulty and no small amount of suffering, the Christian Byzantine Empire inherited what Rome had built and tried to hold it all together. By the 11th century, the Byzantines were struggling. Their eastern borders, once fortified and confident, were beginning to fray. A new people had arrived from the steppes of Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks, nomadic, Muslim, extraordinarily skilled on horseback. In 1071, at a place called Manzikert near the headwaters of the Euphrates River, the Seljuks defeated the Byzantine army so decisively that they effectively cracked Anatolia open. The Byzantine emperor was captured alive, which was a thing that had almost never happened before, and suggested strongly that something fundamental had shifted. Over the decades that followed, waves of Turkic peoples, tribesmen, warriors, herdsmen, dervishes, poets, filtered into Anatolia from the east. They settled in the valleys, they grazed their flocks on Byzantine pastures, they built mosques in towns that had once had churches. The Seljuks established their own sultanate in the centre of Anatolia, with its capital at Konya, a city surrounded by flat plains where the great mystic poet Rumi would later spin his verses and his dervishes into immortality. But the Seljuks themselves were eventually hit from the east, hit so hard that it changed the shape of the world. The Mongols arrived in the 13th century like a storm that had no interest in negotiating. They destroyed Baghdad in 1258, one of the most devastating moments in Islamic history, ending the Abbasid Caliphate that had served as the spiritual centre of the Muslim world for 5 centuries. They shattered the Seljuk Sultanate. They pushed refugees and warriors westward in great disorganized floods. Among the chaos that followed, dozens of small principalities, called beyliks, emerged across Anatolia. Each was ruled by a local Turkish chieftain, a bey, who commanded a band of warriors and controlled whatever territory he could hold. These principalities squabbled with one another. They raided Byzantine frontier towns. They served sometimes as allies and sometimes as enemies to whoever was paying. One of these principalities was so small and so obscure that contemporary chroniclers barely noted it down. It sat in the northwest corner of Anatolia near the city of Bursa, in a landscape of rolling hills, dense forests and fertile river valleys. Its borders were modest. Its treasury was not impressive. Its founder was a man whose name history would make vast, though in his own lifetime he was simply one chieftain among many. His name was Osman. Nobody knows exactly when Osman was born. The sources are thin and often contradictory, written decades or centuries after the fact by chroniclers working from legend as much as memory. What seems clear is that he was born sometime in the 1250s, the son of a chieftain named Ertuğrul, who led a small band of Kaya Turks in the fertile borderlands of northwestern Anatolia. The borderlands were a particular kind of place. Historians call them the UC, the frontier, and they had their own culture, their own logic, their own morality. Out here, Byzantine authority had become a ghost of itself. The great walls of Constantinople were a long way away. The local Byzantine lords ruled from fortified hill towns and mostly hoped the Turks would raid someone else. The Mongols were a constant pressure from the east. Everything was fluid, everything was negotiable, and a strong man with loyal followers and a good horse could carve out something real. Osman was, by all accounts, exactly that kind of man. He was generous with plunder, which kept his warriors loyal. He was careful in his alliances, marrying into established families rather than fighting them. He was religiously devout in the practical frontier way. Not a theologian, but a man who observed prayer and respected holy men and understood that religious legitimacy was a tool of governance as important as a sword. One of the most famous stories about Osman involves a dream. The details vary depending on the source, but the core of it runs like this. Osman was sleeping in the house of a respected Islamic scholar and holy man named Shaykh Edebali, a man of considerable spiritual authority in that region. In his dream, Osman saw a great tree growing from his own chest. Its branches spread until they covered mountains and rivers, until they shaded the whole world. Its roots reached down into the earth of 3 continents. A crescent moon hung in its canopy. And from Osman's chest, from the very place where the tree had taken root, came rivers that watered all the lands beneath its shade. Edebali interpreted the dream as a prophecy of empire. He gave Osman his daughter in marriage and his blessing, and the alliance between the warrior and the holy man became one of the founding myths of a dynasty. Whether Osman truly had this dream, or whether the story was composed later by chroniclers who already knew the empire's outcome and wanted a satisfying origin, is impossible to say. But the myth tells us something real about how the early Ottoman state understood itself, as something divinely ordained, as something rooted in spiritual authority, as something whose growth was not merely military, but cosmic. In the years around 1299, a date that later Ottoman historians would adopt as the founding of the empire, though the transition was gradual rather than sudden, Osman began to press more aggressively against Byzantine towns and fortresses. His approach was patient. He rarely attempted a direct assault on well-defended walls. Instead, he cut off roads, disrupted farming, choked off supply lines. He waited. Fortresses that could not receive food or reinforcement eventually surrendered. In 1301, his forces defeated a Byzantine army near the village of Bathius, a victory significant enough to attract attention from Constantinople. Refugees began moving out of the contested zone. Byzantine settlers who had lived alongside Turks for generations now found themselves in a frontier that had become genuinely dangerous, and they drifted westward towards safer ground, toward the great city behind its famous walls. Osman died around 1323 or 1324 before he saw Bursa fall. But Bursa did fall in 1326 under his son Orhan, and with its capture the Ottomans had their first major city, their first real capital, their first treasury, and their first sense that what they were building was not merely a raid but a kingdom. Osman was buried in Bursa, in a tomb that would be visited for centuries by Ottoman sultans as the first act of their reign, a pilgrimage back to the beginning, to the small dream from which the vast empire had grown, conquered territory with something approaching method. The expansion under Orhan moved mostly westward and northward. The Byzantine city of Iznik, ancient Nicaea where the early Christian church had defined its creed, fell in 1331. Izmit fell in 1337. These were not small towns on the edge of nowhere. They were historic cities, seats of bishops, centres of trade, and their fall announced clearly that the frontier principality was becoming something else. More remarkable still was Orhan's relationship with the Byzantines. Rather than simply fighting them, he entered into alliance with a Byzantine emperor named John VI, Cantacuzenus, who was fighting a civil war against a rival claimant. Orhan married John's daughter, Theodora, taking her as a wife alongside his existing Turkish wife, and sent Ottoman troops to fight on the Byzantine side. It was an extraordinary arrangement, one that placed Ottoman soldiers on European soil for the first time, in Thrace, across the narrow strait from Anatolia. They went there as allies. They noticed the land. They remembered what they had seen. Orhan's eldest son Suleiman crossed the Dardanelles Strait in 1354 and established the first permanent Ottoman foothold on European soil at a place called Gallipoli, Gallibalu in Turkish, which 300 years later would echo with different armies and different catastrophes. The crossing was quiet, almost accidental in the way that history sometimes unfolds. An earthquake had damaged the fortifications of a small Byzantine fort. Suleiman's men simply moved in. It was a beginning that felt small, but it was not small at all. When Orhan died and his son Murad I took power, the expansion into Europe accelerated. Murad moved into Thrace, the European territory north of Constantinople. He took Adrianople, the city the Turks called Edirne, in 1369 and made it the new Ottoman capital. It was a city in the heart of the Balkans, surrounded by rivers, surrounded by Christians, and making it the capital was a statement of ambition so clear that it needed no translation. Under Murad, the Ottoman state developed one of its most distinctive and controversial institutions, the devshirme. This was a system by which young Christian boys from the Balkans and Anatolia were taken from their families by Ottoman officials at regular intervals. They were converted to Islam, educated in Ottoman languages and customs, and trained either as soldiers, the famous janissaries, or as administrators. The most capable among them rose through an entirely merit-based system to positions of enormous power. Grand viziers who ran the empire, generals who commanded armies, architects who designed mosques, many came through the devshirme. The system was, by any modern reckoning, coercive and deeply strange. It separated boys from their parents, erased their previous identities, and made their advancement contingent on abandoning the faith of their birth. And yet, the men who came through it often rose to heights no freeborn Muslim could reach, because the sultans trusted their loyalty. Men without families, without tribal affiliations, without outside obligations, more than they trusted anyone else. The devshirme was simultaneously an act of cultural violence and one of the most sophisticated meritocracies of the medieval world. In 1389, on the Field of Blackbirds, Kosovo Poli, Murad I faced a coalition of Serbian and Bosnian princes in a battle that both sides claimed as their own story. The Ottomans won, Serbia became a vassal, and Murad himself was killed, either during the battle or immediately after it, by a Serbian nobleman who had gained access to his tent under the pretense of surrender. It is one of the strangest moments in Ottoman history. The Sultan who secured the empire's presence in Europe killed at the very moment of his greatest triumph. His son Bayezid I, who was at his father's side, had his brother strangled before the sun set on Kosovo. It was the beginning of a practice, the killing of rival claimants to the throne, that would become one of the empire's most terrible features, and also, in the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics, one of its most effective tools for preventing civil war. Bayezid was given the epithet Yildirim, the thunderbolt, for the speed of his military campaigns. He blockaded Constantinople, tightening the noose around the Byzantine capital so thoroughly that the emperor had to beg the kings of Europe for help. He smashed a crusading army at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, a defeat so decisive that the idea of European military reconquest of the Balkans effectively died there, and then, from the east, came something nobody had prepared for. He called himself Timur. Europeans called him Tamerlane, a corruption of Timuri Leng, Timur the Lame, a reference to wounds he had received in battle that left him with a permanent limp. He was born near Samarkand in what is now Uzbekistan, and he built a career of conquest so devastating that historians still struggle to describe it without reaching for words like apocalyptic. Timur was not a Mongol by blood, though he claimed descent from Genghis Khan by marriage. He was Turkic, Muslim, and possessed of a military genius that made him one of the most dangerous men who had ever lived. He conquered Persia, Iraq, Syria, India. His sack of Delhi in 1398 killed so many people that the city took a century to recover. He rebuilt pyramids of skulls outside the cities he destroyed, not out of madness but out of policy, as a message to those who resisted him. By 1400, Timur turned his attention westward, toward Anatolia, where Ottoman power had grown in ways that interested and annoyed him. He received embassies from Bayezid. Bayezid sent back letters that, in the language of medieval correspondence, were insulting. Timur was called old and impotent. Bayezid was called a flea. They met at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. Bayezid's army was large and experienced, but Timur's was larger and more experienced, and crucially Timur had convinced several of the Anatolian Turkish beyliks, who resented Ottoman domination, to switch sides. When the battle reached its crisis point, whole contingents of Bayezid's army simply turned and walked away. Bayezid was captured alive. He was an Ottoman sultan in chains, sitting in the tent of a conqueror. The sources disagree about how he was treated. Some say he was humiliated, forced to serve as a footstool or a door holder. Others say he was treated with the courtesy owed to a fallen king. He died in captivity a year later, either of illness or grief, and his death left the Ottoman state in a condition nobody had foreseen. The dynasty survived, but barely, and only after a decade of civil war among his sons. This period, from 1402 to 1413, is called the Interregnum, the time between rulers. 4 of Bayezid's sons fought each other across the wreckage of their father's domain. The Byzantines, given a miraculous reprieve, played the brothers against each other with careful diplomatic skill. Timur had restored the Anatolian beyliks, shrinking Ottoman territory dramatically. The Janissaries, the Devshirme soldiers, were unsure whom to serve. It was Mehmed I who eventually won. He was the quietest of Bayezid's sons, the most patient, and patience turned out to be the decisive quality. He reunified the Ottoman state by 1413, began the painstaking work of restoration, and died in 1421 having done something remarkable. Rebuilt a shattered empire without anyone writing very much about how difficult it was. His son Murad II continued the restoration and then the expansion. He besieged Constantinople but could not take it. He fought the Hungarians and the Poles, and at the Battle of Varna in 1444 destroyed another crusade. He was a complex figure who twice abdicated in favour of his young son, then had to be brought back from monastic retirement when the boy was overwhelmed by crises. He was a man who seemed to want peace more than glory, yet who fought almost constantly, and his reign was a long, difficult stabilisation of an empire that was ready, by his death in 1451, to become something genuinely astonishing. The son who succeeded him was 19 years old. He'd grown up under immense pressure, been sultan twice already, watched his father doubt him. He spoke several languages. He read philosophy. He commissioned translations of ancient Greek texts. He kept a court astronomer and a court geographer. He had been obsessed since childhood with a single impossible problem that everyone around him had decided, after 1,000 years, was simply impossible. He wanted to take Constantinople. Constantinople was not simply a city. It was an idea, an idea made of walls and domes and centuries of belief that it could never truly fall. The Romans had chosen this location with the precision of people who understood geography as strategy. The city sat on a triangular peninsula jutting into the water, its southern shore running along the Sea of Marmara, its eastern tip touching the Bosphorus Strait, and its northern side facing an inlet called the Golden Horn, so named, it was said, for the gold-coloured light that lay on its waters at sunset. 3 sides of the city were water. One side, the land wall on the western edge, was defended by the most sophisticated fortification system of the ancient world. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, were actually a triple system: an outer moat, an outer wall, a terrace, an inner wall, rising to heights of nearly 15 metres in places, studded with 96 towers, stretching for more than 6 kilometres from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. They had been repaired and reinforced constantly. They had deflected Avars and Persians and Arabs and Vikings and Crusaders. 1,000 years of assault had not broken them. Inside those walls lived something between 50 and 100,000 people by 1451, a shadow of the city's former million, hollowed by plague and economic decline and the long shrinking of Byzantine territory, but still impressive, still functioning, still the centre of Orthodox Christianity and the keeper of a culture that connected the ancient world to the medieval one. The Hagia Sophia still stood at the heart of the city, its dome floating above the streetscape like a miracle in stone and mortar, its interior dim with gold mosaic and incense smoke and the deep singing of Byzantine chant. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, who had inherited this city and this burden, was a capable man in an impossible position. He sent diplomats to the Pope, to Venice, to Hungary, asking for help. The replies were sympathetic and mostly useless. A small contingent of Genoese volunteers came, led by a man named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a soldier of considerable reputation who took command of the wall defence. There were perhaps 7,000 soldiers in total to defend walls that needed 40,000. Mehmed II, the new Ottoman Sultan, prepared with a seriousness that was itself a kind of genius. He arranged his diplomacy to ensure no major power would intervene. He surveyed the walls himself, riding along their length, noting the weak points with the eye of someone who had been studying this problem for years. He commissioned the construction of a massive fortress, Rumeli Hisar, on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an older Ottoman fortress on the Asian side, effectively sealing the strait and cutting Constantinople off from the Black Sea and all the grain supplies that came down it. And then he hired a cannon maker. His name was Urban, and he was Hungarian, and he had first offered his services to the Byzantine emperor, who could not afford him. Mehmed could. Urban built a cannon of extraordinary size. Its barrel was more than 8 meters long. It required 60 oxen to move, and the sound of its firing reportedly shook the windows of houses 12 kilometers away. It could not fire rapidly. Reloading took hours. But what it could do was something no previous weapon had managed. It could crack the Theodosian walls. The siege began in April 1453. The Ottoman army outside those walls numbered perhaps 80,000 men. The fleet numbered more than 100 ships. The defenders on the walls, watching this force arrange itself in the April light, must have known something they did not want to know. What followed was 53 days of siege. The cannon fired daily, each shot sending chunks of ancient masonry into rubble, and each night the defenders worked frantically to patch the breaches with timber and earth. A chain stretched across the Golden Horn to keep the Ottoman fleet out of the inlet, and Mehmed responded by having his ships carried overland on greased logs, an operation that defied belief, swinging the Ottoman fleet into the Golden Horn behind the chain. The end came in the darkness before dawn on May 29th. 3 waves of assault hit the walls simultaneously. The first 2 waves, irregular troops and then Anatolian regulars, were repulsed at great cost. Then came the Janissaries, the Sultan's finest troops, moving through smoke and darkness with the disciplined terror of men who had known nothing but this their entire lives. Giustiniani was wounded. Whether he withdrew because the wound was truly incapacitating or because his nerve broke in that terrible hour is a question chroniclers have argued ever since. He was carried from the wall on a stretcher, and the sight of him leaving broke the heart of the defence. The Janissaries found a small unlocked gate, the Kirkoporta, and pushed through it. By the time the sun rose over the Bosphorus, Ottoman soldiers were inside the city. The last Byzantine emperor was dead somewhere in the melee, and Constantinople belonged to Mehmed II. He entered the city calmly, on horseback. He rode to the Hagia Sophia. He knelt and prayed. He gave an order that no further looting should occur. The initial hours of sack had been permitted, as was customary, but he wanted the city intact. He wanted it to be a capital, not a ruin. He would call himself from that moment Fatih, the conqueror. What did Constantinople look like in those first months of Ottoman rule? There are accounts from survivors, both Ottoman chroniclers and Venetian and Genoese merchants who stayed behind. What emerges is a picture of a city that had suffered its conquest, but was already beginning to exhale, to open its eyes, to wonder what the new order would mean. Mehmed moved quickly to repopulate the city. Constantinople's population had shrunk so dramatically during the Byzantine decline that entire neighbourhoods were empty. Streets of abandoned houses, churches without congregations, gardens gone to bramble. Mehmed issued invitations, sometimes forcible transfers, bringing people in from other parts of the empire. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, particularly Sephardic Jews who had been expelled from Spain in 1492, 39 years later, and who found in the Ottoman Empire a welcome that Europe had not offered them, all settled in Constantinople. The city that had been dying became something new and plural. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. Minarets were added at its corners over the following decades. The great mosaic portraits of Christ and the Virgin Mary were plastered over, though not destroyed, preserved in a way, beneath plaster, waiting centuries for rediscovery. The transformation was complete, and it was also, in the strange logic of Mehmed's mind, a kind of continuation. He understood the weight of what he had inherited. He commissioned scholars to come to his court. He sat for his portrait with the Venetian painter Gentil Bellini in 1479, posing with a rose at his nose, an image of sophisticated ease that would have surprised anyone who knew him only as a military conqueror. He read Ptolemy's geography in Latin translation and thought about what the world looked like from above. He built the Grand Bazaar, that labyrinth of vaulted stone corridors and covered market stalls that would eventually sprawl across 61 covered streets and hold more than 4,000 shops, becoming one of the largest covered markets in the world, a place where the entire economy of the Mediterranean and beyond seemed to pool and circulate. He built the first Topkapi Palace, not yet the elaborate sprawling complex it would become under later sultans, but already a statement. A palace on the high point of the peninsula, its walls dropping to the sea on two sides, its courtyards designed as successive thresholds of intimacy and power. Visitors and diplomats were received in the outer courts. Only the trusted moved inward. The inner sanctum, the harem, the private chambers, the place where the Sultan lived his private life, was invisible to all but a few. The city became known simply as Istanbul, a name derived from a Greek phrase meaning roughly "to the city" or "in the city," the kind of casual direction you'd give someone who already knew where the significant place was. The Ottomans used both names for a while, Constantinople and Istanbul, as did Europeans, who called it Constantinople until 1930, when Turkey officially requested the world use only Istanbul. Mehmed II died in 1481, at 50 years old, either of gout or poison. His death was suspicious enough that his son Bayezid II, who succeeded him, had the court physicians executed. He left behind an empire that stretched from the Danube River to the Euphrates, that controlled the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and that had permanently ended the Byzantine civilization that had been Rome's most extraordinary afterlife. He had been brilliant and cruel, visionary and violent, a man who murdered his own infant brother to prevent future rivalry, and then sat quietly reading Plutarch's Lives. He remains one of the most fascinating and disturbing figures of the 15th century, and the city he rebuilt would become, over the following 300 years, perhaps the most extraordinary capital on earth. To understand the Ottoman Empire, it helps to understand its buildings, not just as architecture, though the architecture is genuinely astonishing, but as philosophy made physical. The Ottomans understood that space communicates, that the arrangement of rooms and courtyards and fountains tells people who they are and where they stand in relation to power, to God, to other people. The mosque was the centre of urban life in a way that has no precise equivalent in modern experience. It was a place of prayer 5 times a day, but also a place of refuge, of community gathering, of legal mediation, of education. Adjacent to every major mosque was typically a kulliyeh, a complex that might include a school, a hospital, a kitchen that fed the poor, a caravanserai, a bathhouse. The mosque and its supporting institutions functioned as a kind of welfare state and community centre, wrapped in a single architectural vision. The greatest of these complexes were built in Istanbul, and the greatest of the great was the Suleymaniye, built between 1550 and 1558 under the supervision of the chief architect Sinan. Sinan was himself a product of the Devshirme, a Christian boy from central Anatolia, converted, educated, made into something extraordinary. He trained as a military engineer before discovering his vocation in architecture, and what he built across a career of astonishing length and productivity, he was still designing buildings in his 90s, defined the Ottoman architectural vocabulary. The Suleymaniye sits on one of Istanbul's hills, visible from the sea, its 4 minarets rising at the corners of the main dome like exclamation points against the sky. The dome itself is not the largest Sinan built. That would be the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, which he considered his masterpiece. But the Suleymaniye complex as a whole is a complete world. Schools of different levels surrounded the mosque, including a medical school, a school of hadith, a school of Quran recitation. A hospital stood nearby, a market, 2 bathhouses. The kitchens fed hundreds of people daily. At the edge of the complex, looking out over the Golden Horn, is the tomb of Suleiman the Magnificent himself, and beside it, in her own smaller but equally elegant tomb, rests Hurrem Sultan, his wife. The tombs are quiet places now, open to visitors, their walls covered with Iznik tiles in shades of cobalt blue and turquoise, and the brilliant red that Iznik potters mastered in the 16th century, and later lost the secret of for 200 years. The tiles tell you something about how the Ottomans thought about beauty, intensely patterned, botanical in inspiration, full of arabesques and stylized tulips and geometric interlacings that go on repeating in variations that never quite duplicate themselves. It is a beauty that rewards long attention. The longer you look, the more you see. Iznik itself, that city where Orhan's forces had once triumphed over the Byzantines, became in the 16th century the center of the most important ceramic production in the Islamic world. The tiles came from its kilns. The plates and bowls that decorated palace tables came from its workshops. The potters there developed, through generations of experiment, a palette and a technique that has never been entirely replicated. The deep, slightly bluish white of the ground, the vivid cobalt of the inscriptions, the tomato red that seems to stand slightly above the surface of the glaze, these are qualities that museum conservators today can identify in a fragment no bigger than a fingernail. The Topkapi Palace grew through the reigns of many sultans, accreting courtyards and pavilions and libraries the way a tree adds rings. Each sultan added something, a throne room, a treasury, a new suite for the harem. The complex came to cover nearly 70 hectares on the high point of the peninsula, surrounded by high walls, overlooking the Bosphorus on one side and the Sea of Marmara on the other, a city within the city that housed not just the Sultan, but several thousand residents, wives, concubines, children, servants, guards, physicians, astrologers, musicians, gardeners. To enter the palace was to enter a world organised entirely around the gradual revelation of power. The first courtyard was semi-public. Tradesmen could enter. Deliveries came through the imperial gate. The second courtyard, accessed through the Gate of Salutation, was where administrative functions happened. The Divan, or Imperial Council, met under its domed chambers. Beyond the Gate of Felicity lay the third courtyard, where the Sultan received ambassadors in the audience chamber, a pavilion with a fountain so positioned that its sound masked conversation from eavesdroppers. The fourth courtyard, highest and innermost, was the Sultan's private garden, a world of tulips and fountains and pavilions with views that stretched to Asia. The harem is the most misunderstood part of the palace. In the popular imagination, shaped by Orientalist paintings and Victorian novels, it was a garden of pleasure, a collection of beautiful women kept for one man's amusement. The reality was considerably more complex and considerably more serious. The harem, the word means forbidden or sacred, was the private household of the Sultan, and it was primarily a world of women who wielded real power through connection, information, and relationship. The Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, was often the most powerful woman in the empire, and not infrequently one of the most powerful people in it. She could receive ambassadors, correspond with foreign rulers, direct patronage, and influence policy in ways that were understood and accepted as legitimate. The architecture of the harem reflected this complexity. It was not a prison, though it was an enclosed world. It had its own hierarchy, its own economy, its own social dynamics. Women moved within it, educated themselves, formed factions, competed for influence. The most remarkable of them became historical figures in their own right. Between Mehmed the Conqueror and the supreme moment of Ottoman glory, there is a figure who is often overshadowed, but who shaped everything that followed. Selim I, who ruled from 1512 to 1520, and whose epithet, Yavuz, the grim or the stern, gives some sense of the impression he made on people who knew him. Selim came to power through violence that was becoming a pattern. Ottoman succession had no fixed rule of primogeniture. The eldest son did not automatically inherit. All of the Sultan's sons were potential heirs, which meant they were also potential threats to each other. The system encouraged both political sophistication in the sons and horrifying cruelty at moments of transition. Selim solved the succession problem preemptively by defeating his father Bayezid II in battle, forcing him to abdicate and then having his brothers strangled. It was brutal. It was also, by Ottoman standards, efficient. Selim immediately turned east toward a threat that had been growing along the Ottoman eastern border with an intensity that was partly military and partly theological. The Safavid dynasty of Persia had converted their kingdom to Twelver Shia Islam and were actively proselytizing among the population of eastern Anatolia. The appeal was real. Many Anatolian Turks had Sufi affiliations and heterodox beliefs that the Safavids were skillfully cultivating. Selim regarded this as an existential threat. In 1514, at the Battle of Chaldiran in what is now northwestern Iran, Selim's army met the Safavid Shah Ismail in a confrontation that was partly a military battle and partly a statement about the future shape of the Middle East. The Ottomans had artillery. The Safavids, operating under a belief that gunpowder weapons were somehow unmanly or impious, had cavalry. Extraordinary cavalry, but cavalry nonetheless. The Ottoman guns were decisive. The Safavids were routed. Chaldiran established the Ottoman-Safavid border roughly where it remained for the next 3 centuries, and it hardened the religious distinction between the two empires, Sunni Ottoman, Shia Safavid, into a permanent geopolitical fault line that continues to shape the Middle East today. Then Selim turned south into the Arab world. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria was the other great power of the Middle East in this period. The Mamluks were extraordinary warriors, an elite of enslaved soldiers, mostly Circassian and Turkish in origin, who had ruled Egypt for more than 2 centuries and produced some of the finest military minds of the medieval period. They had stopped the Mongols. They had defended the Islamic world against the Crusaders. They were not accustomed to losing. Selim met them at the Battle of Majd-Dabik, north of Aleppo, in 1516. The Mamluks still relied primarily on cavalry and personal combat skill. The Ottomans had artillery and janissary infantry. The result was as decisive as Chaldiran. The Mamluk Sultan died in the battle, and Syria fell to the Ottomans within weeks. Egypt followed in 1517 after another battle near Cairo. Selim entered Cairo and took custody of the last Abbasid caliph, a figurehead who had been maintained by the Mamluks as a source of religious legitimacy. The transfer of the caliphate to the Ottomans, whether it was a formal ceremony or something more ambiguous, became an important part of Ottoman self-understanding, a claim to spiritual leadership of the Sunni Muslim world that sultans would invoke for centuries. Selim died in 1520, having expanded the empire's territory by perhaps 70% in 8 years of campaigning. He was 50 years old. He had reportedly been working on plans for a naval expedition in the Mediterranean when illness caught him. He was not, by any ordinary measure, a pleasant man. He reportedly executed 7 of his grand viziers during his short reign. He was known for his rages and for a sarcasm so cutting that it sometimes preceded an execution order. But he was also, in the strange mathematics of early modern history, the man who made the next reign possible, the reign that would sit at the peak of the mountain he had built. His son was named Suleiman. History would call him the Magnificent. There is a particular quality of morning light on the Bosphorus in early summer. It comes over the hills of Asia and strikes the water and then bounces upward, filling the whole scene with a brightness that is neither harsh nor soft, but simply clear, the kind of clarity that makes everything look significant. On such a morning in 1520, Suleiman I, who had spent his adolescence governing provinces and learning administration, who had read and studied and waited, became Sultan of an empire that was already the most powerful on earth, and proceeded to make it more so. He ruled for 46 years, longer than almost any other sultan in the dynasty's history, and in that time the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, its most sophisticated administrative structure, and its most celebrated cultural output. He was called Magnificent by Europeans, who encountered him as a military force and a diplomatic partner of unprecedented sophistication. His own subjects called him Kanuni, the lawgiver, a name that tells you what they valued most about him, for it was the codification of law, the systematization of justice, that his contemporaries saw as his deepest achievement. Suleiman's reign opened with campaigns that announced the scale of his ambitions. In 1521, he took Belgrade, the fortress city on the Danube that had twice repulsed his great-grandfather Mehmed II. In 1522, he took Rhodes, expelling the Knights of St. John, a crusading military order who had used the island as a base for piracy against Ottoman shipping after a siege of several months. He allowed the knights to leave alive with their arms, a gesture of chivalric magnanimity that contemporaries noticed and recorded. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohács on a flat Hungarian plain, his army annihilated a Hungarian force in less than 2 hours and killed the Hungarian king Louis II, who drowned in retreat in a swollen stream while wearing his heavy armour. The Hungarian kingdom effectively ceased to exist as an independent state. Within decades, the Ottomans would control most of it, with the rest divided between the Habsburgs and a Transylvanian vassal state that balanced carefully between the two great powers. In 1529, Suleiman laid siege to Vienna. He had pushed further into Europe than any Ottoman army before him, and the city of Vienna, the Habsburg capital, the gateway to the western half of the continent, sat ahead of him, fortified and frightened. The siege failed. His supply lines were overextended, the season was turning cold, and the city's defences proved stronger than expected. He withdrew, and he would try again in 1532 without reaching Vienna at all. The Ottoman high water mark in Europe would remain not far from where Suleiman had reached, but these military campaigns are only part of what made the reign remarkable. The administration of the empire was a project of almost equal ambition. Suleiman and his great vizier Ibrahim Pasha, a man who had risen from Greek slave boy through the devshirme to become the most powerful official in the Ottoman government, and eventually the Sultan's closest friend, worked to systematize Ottoman law, to reconcile Islamic jurisprudence with the empire's complex realities, to create something that functioned as a consistent legal order across territories that stretched from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to the Persian Gulf. The Kanunnameh, codes of law issued under Suleiman's name, covered everything from the salaries of different grades of official to the rights of peasants on crown land to the regulations governing the guilds of Istanbul. They were sophisticated documents that tried to translate the principles of Islamic law into practical governance across an enormously diverse empire. They were also, inevitably, imperfect, applied inconsistently, ignored in distant provinces, circumvented by those with power. But the aspiration matters, and the structure mattered, and it lasted. The physical world of Suleiman's Istanbul was being built by Sinan, whose career as court architect began during this reign, and produced works that redefined what Islamic architecture could be. But it was also being shaped by poets and painters and musicians and calligraphers who were among the finest in the Islamic world. The court was a place of genuine cultural production, not merely of patronage. Suleiman himself wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibbi, the affectionate, and some of his verses survive, technically accomplished and personally revealing in ways that surprise readers who expect only grandeur. He wrote poetry partly about war and empire and duty, as expected. He also wrote about love. She was called Roxolana by Europeans, a name that suggested she came from Ruthenia, what is now western Ukraine, though the exact details of her origin are not entirely certain. Within the Ottoman world she was known as Hurrem, a name meaning roughly the cheerful one, or she who laughs, given to her after she arrived in the palace, possibly as a slave purchased in a market, possibly as a prisoner of a raid on Polish or Ukrainian territory. What happened next was almost unprecedented in Ottoman history. Suleiman became not merely attracted to her, but genuinely, deeply attached. A kind of attachment that Ottoman sultans were not supposed to develop with any one woman, because attachment created vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous. He freed her. He married her, formally, legally, in a ceremony that was extraordinary enough that foreign ambassadors wrote reports about it home. And then she remained the only woman in his life, a monogamy unique among Ottoman sultans, never adequately explained by historians who have thought hard about it. She was intelligent and politically capable in ways that the system rewarded, even as it officially constrained her. She corresponded with foreign rulers, with Sigismund Augustus of Poland, with the Safavid Shah, on Suleiman's behalf and in her own voice. She commissioned charitable buildings, a mosque complex in Istanbul, a bathhouse near the Hagia Sophia that is still in use. She maintained relationships with officials throughout the court that gave her information and leverage. She navigated the complex politics of the harem with what sources suggest was a combination of charm, strategic generosity, and an acute reading of where power actually lay. The most contested aspect of her career is her role in two tragedies. Ibrahim Pasha, the vizier, the Sultan's closest friend, the man who had helped design the administrative structure of the empire, was executed in 1536 after more than a decade at the height of power. Hürrem's dislike of Ibrahim and her possible role in orchestrating his fall is a matter of speculation rather than documented fact. But the timing made contemporaries suspicious, and their suspicion has echoed through Ottoman historiography ever since. More certain, and more devastating, is the execution of Shehzadeh Mustafa in 1553. Mustafa was Suleiman's eldest son by a different mother, widely regarded as capable and popular, considered by much of the military as the natural heir. He was executed on Suleiman's order inside a tent during a military campaign by the Sultan's own mutes, the deaf mutes who served as executioners precisely because they could not hear the last pleas of the condemned. The official reason was treason, a suggestion that Mustafa had been in contact with the Safavids or planning to seize power. Whether this was true, and whether Hürrem's desire to secure the succession for her own sons played a role in shaping Suleiman's decision, remains one of Ottoman history's most debated questions. Hürrem died in 1558, several years before Suleiman. He reportedly had her buried with immense ceremony. He died 8 years later, in 1566, on campaign in Hungary, at the siege of a fortress called Szigetvár. He had been ill, and when the fortress finally fell, he had been dead for several hours. His death was kept secret from the army to prevent panic. He was buried in the tomb that stands beside the Suleymaniye Mosque, within sight of the Golden Horn. His reign, 46 years of it, had seen the empire reach heights that would never quite be surpassed. The Mediterranean in the 16th century was not a peaceful sea. It was a theatre of constant competition, piracy, religious war and commercial manoeuvring, and the Ottomans were determined to make it their own. The key figure in this maritime ambition was a man whose origins are debated, possibly Greek, possibly from the island of Lesbos, possibly Albanian, who had built a career of piracy in the Western Mediterranean that was so effective he became the most feared naval commander of his age. He is known in history as Hayreddin Barbarossa, a name Europeans gave him for his red beard, and his career illustrates something important about how the Ottoman Empire worked. It was capable of absorbing extraordinary talents from unexpected places and deploying them at a scale the individual could never have reached alone. Barbarossa and his brother Arouj had built a base of operations in North Africa, particularly in what is now Algeria, where they raided European shipping and coastal settlements with remarkable success. When the Spanish threatened to overwhelm them, Barbarossa offered his allegiance to Suleiman and became an Ottoman admiral, the Grand Admiral, or Capudan Pasha, of the Ottoman fleet. He brought to Istanbul not just his personal genius, but the entire network of North African corsair ports, effectively extending Ottoman naval power across the entire Mediterranean. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza off the coast of Greece, the Ottoman fleet decisively defeated a combined Habsburg-Venetian papal fleet. The victory effectively made the eastern and central Mediterranean an Ottoman lake for several decades. Spanish shipping had to be protected. Coastal Italian towns lived in fear of raid. The galleys of the Ottoman navy were the most capable in the sea. The decisive moment of contest came in 1571 at the Battle of Lepanto off the western coast of Greece. A Holy League assembled by Pope Pius V, Spain, Venice, Genoa, the papacy, various smaller Italian states, met the Ottoman fleet in a battle that was both genuinely pivotal and immediately mythologized. The League won, destroying or capturing most of the Ottoman fleet, killing tens of thousands of Ottoman sailors. Lepanto was a shock. It was the first significant Ottoman military defeat in a very long time, and the symbolic impact across Europe was enormous. Church bells rang, poets wrote hymns, Cervantes fought in the battle and lost the use of his left hand and considered it his proudest distinction. But the practical impact was more limited than the celebration suggested. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within 2 years, at a pace that astonished Venice's ambassador to Constantinople. What Lepanto actually ended was Ottoman expansion westward in the Mediterranean. The deep push into the western basin became impossible. What it did not end was Ottoman power in the eastern Mediterranean, which remained formidable for another century. The sea also mattered commercially in ways that the battles often obscure. The Ottoman Empire controlled the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, Alexandria in Egypt, Beirut, Tripoli, Acre, Istanbul itself, through which flowed the trade goods of Asia, spices from the Maluku Islands, silk from Persia and China, cotton from India, coffee from Yemen. The great merchant families of Istanbul, of Alexandria, of Aleppo grew wealthy on this transit trade, and the Ottoman government grew wealthy taxing it. Coffee deserves a particular moment of attention. Here, because it arrived in Istanbul in the mid-16th century and proceeded to transform the social life of the city. It came from Yemen, where it had been cultivated and consumed for perhaps 2 centuries before reaching the Ottoman capital. The first coffee house in Istanbul opened around 1555, and within a decade the city had hundreds of them. Men gathered in coffee houses not just to drink but to talk, to play backgammon, to listen to storytellers, to read poetry aloud, to discuss theology and politics and the news of the day. The coffee house was a democratic space in a society where most spaces were carefully hierarchical. You could sit beside a grand vizier if you arrived first and had the price of a cup. The authorities tried several times to close the coffee houses. They were places where sedition could brew as readily as the drink. But the coffee houses always reopened, because the demand was too strong and the social function too deeply embedded. Behind the great campaigns and the palace intrigues and the naval battles, the vast majority of the empire's people led lives that were quieter, more repetitive, and in many ways more interesting to think about than the events that fill history books. The empire at its peak governed perhaps 30 million people across 3 continents. Among them were Turkish-speaking farmers in Anatolia, Arabic-speaking merchants in Syria and Egypt, Greek fishermen on Aegean islands, Serbian shepherds in the Balkans, Jewish cloth merchants in Salonika, Kurdish tribal chiefs in the eastern mountains, Armenian craftsmen in Istanbul, Berber tribesmen in North Africa, Armenian and Greek and Jewish and Muslim scholars in the cities, Romani musicians and traders who moved through the empire's roads with a freedom that most people lacked. The peasant majority, perhaps 80 or 85% of the population, lived in villages and worked the land. In Anatolia, the typical village had a mosque, a fountain, an olive press or a mill, a handful of extended family compounds arranged around shared space. People grew wheat and barley, tended orchards of olives and figs and pomegranates, kept goats and sheep and chickens. In good years, there was enough. In bad years, drought, locust plagues, epidemic disease, the passage of armies, there was genuine hunger. The Ottoman state's relationship with its peasantry was governed by the Timar system during the empire's classical period. Cavalry officers, sipahis, were granted the right to collect tax revenues from a particular area of land in exchange for showing up on campaign with a certain number of armed men. The peasants who worked that land paid their taxes to the sipahi, rather than directly to the state, a feudal arrangement with Islamic characteristics that kept the cavalry force funded without requiring a permanent central treasury to pay them. The system worked reasonably well when the empire was expanding. There were always new TMRs to distribute, always new conquered land to reward military service. It worked less well as expansion slowed and the supply of land dried up and inflation eroded the value of fixed income grants, and the whole machinery began to strain. Urban life was organized around guilds, lonka, which controlled the production and sale of every significant commodity in the city. Bakers' guilds, butchers' guilds, tanners' guilds, goldsmiths' guilds, each with their own regulations, their own hierarchies of master and apprentice, their own patron saint or holy figure, their own role in the city's ceremonial life. When a new sultan was enthroned, the guilds processed through the streets of Istanbul in order of seniority, each group dressed in its distinctive costume, carrying symbols of its trade. It could take days for the whole procession to pass a given point. The bazaar was the pulse of urban commerce. The covered bazaar in Istanbul, the great market in Aleppo with its miles of covered streets, the Khan al-Khalili in Cairo, these were not just places of buying and selling, but social institutions where relationships were built, and information travelled and deals were made that shaped the economy of the wider world. Merchants who had traded for years with partners, They had never met face to face, dealing in credit and letters of exchange across thousands of miles, met in these spaces to settle accounts and establish trust in person. The hammam, the bathhouse, was another institution that went far beyond its obvious function. In a world without private plumbing, the public bath was where people got clean, but it was also where marriages were arranged, where news was exchanged, where social rituals were performed. Brides were bathed and adorned in ceremonial hammam rituals before their weddings. Men spent hours in the hot rooms, being scrubbed and massaged and listening to each other's business. Women had their own hours, and the women's hammam was one of the few places where women of different social backgrounds mixed with some degree of ease. Food is always a way into a culture, and Ottoman cuisine is extraordinarily rich. The palace kitchens in Topkapi employed hundreds of cooks organised into specialised units, those who made pilafs, those who made soups, those who made kebabs, those who made pastries, those who made sherbets and jams and pickles. The cooking of the elite incorporated the flavours of the empire, Persian saffron and rosewater, Arabian coffee and spices, Balkan dairy and meat, Anatolian wheat and legumes, Mediterranean olives and herbs, into a synthesis that became the foundation of a cuisine that fed ordinary people as well as sultans. Lamb was the prestige meat, roasted over wood fires, slow cooked with vegetables, ground and formed into kofta of many shapes. Pilaf, rice cooked in stock, sometimes enriched with dried fruit and nuts and spices, was the centerpiece of serious meals. Flatbreads emerged from domed clay ovens in every village. In the cities, professional bakers produced large sesame-crusted rings called simit that were carried through the streets on boards balanced on vendors' heads. Sweet pastries made with paper-thin dough, honey, and ground nuts, the predecessors of what the world now calls baklava, were eaten at festivals and given as gifts at weddings and religious occasions. After Suleiman, something changed, though whether it was decline, as the conventional narrative has long insisted, or transformation, as more recent historians prefer to see it, is a question worth sitting with carefully. The sultans who followed were, with a few exceptions, less directly engaged with military campaigns. They stayed in the palace rather than leading armies in the field. Administration devolved to grand viziers. The harem, and the influential women within it, played a larger role in decisions. These changes happened gradually, across several reigns, and they were read by both contemporary observers and later historians as signs of a civilization losing its vitality. The reality was more complicated. The empire was not contracting militarily in any meaningful way through most of the late 16th and 17th centuries. Cyprus was taken from Venice in 1571, the very year of Lepanto, giving the Ottomans the largest island in the eastern Mediterranean. Tunis was retaken in 1574. Crete was finally taken from Venice in a war that lasted from 1645 to 1669, a remarkably long conflict that tested both empires severely, with sieges of extraordinary brutality, but which ended with another Ottoman acquisition. The empire continued to govern vast territories and enormous populations. Trade continued to flow through its ports. The cities continued to grow. Istanbul in the 17th century may have had as many as 700,000 or 800,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world, rivaled in population perhaps only by Beijing and possibly Delhi. What was changing was the relative position of the empire within a wider world that was itself changing rapidly. The Portuguese had found a sea route around Africa to India in 1498, and over the following decades, the spice trade that had flowed through Ottoman territories began to be redirected around the Cape of Good Hope. It did not stop flowing through the Ottoman Middle East. The overland and Red Sea routes remained significant for a very long time, but the monopoly was broken, and revenue that had flowed into Ottoman hands began flowing to Lisbon and Antwerp instead. Silver from the Americas flooded European economies through the 16th century, causing inflation that rippled outward. The Ottomans, who used silver coinage, were not immune. The price of everything rose. The Timars that had sustained the Sipahi cavalry lost real value. The Janissaries, who had once been an elite force maintained at great expense, began to be diluted. Their numbers increased, their quality declined. They married and established businesses and became a kind of military caste with corporate interests that were not necessarily the empire's interests. The Devshirme system itself began to break down. As the Janissaries became more interested in protecting their privileges than in military excellence, they resisted the recruitment of new talent from outside. The sons of existing Janissaries began to claim membership. The unique meritocratic character of the institution that had been one of the empire's great strengths gradually eroded. Yet the empire was also, in the 17th century, still capable of producing remarkable things. The Sultan Ahmed Mosque, built between 1609 and 1616, known in the West as the Blue Mosque for the Iznik tiles that line its interior, was one of the most audacious architectural statements of the century. Its architect, Sedefkar Mehmed II, was bold enough to give it 6 minarets, a number that previously only the mosque at Mecca had, a provocation serious enough that a 7th minaret had to be added to the mosque at Mecca to preserve the distinction. Scholars and poets and musicians continued to work. Evliya Çelebi, a traveller of genius who began his journeys in the 1630s and continued for decades, produced a work called the Seyahat-Na'i, the Book of Travels, that is one of the great documents of Ottoman civilization. He was curious about everything and prejudiced about almost nothing, and his observations of cities and customs and people across the empire form an irreplaceable picture of a world that no longer exists. In 1683, the Ottoman Empire made its last great push westward. It was also its most catastrophic failure. The Grand Vizier at the time was Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man of considerable ability who had convinced himself, and the Sultan Mehmed IV, that Vienna, which had withstood Suleiman's siege 150 years earlier, could now be taken. The timing seemed plausible. The Habsburgs were distracted by French pressure in the west, the Hungarians were in revolt, and the Ottoman military still commanded vast resources. The army that moved toward Vienna in 1683 was one of the largest the empire had ever assembled. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 140 and 200,000 soldiers, along with artillery trains, supply convoys, and tens of thousands of camels and horses, moved through Hungary in the early summer. Contemporary accounts describe a column of men and animals that stretched for miles, kicking up dust visible from hilltops 20 kilometers away. The siege of Vienna began in July. The city was defended by a relatively small garrison under Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a meticulous officer who organized the defense with considerable skill. The Ottomans dug tunnels under the walls and collapsed sections of them with mines. The garrison filled the breaches with earth and timber and fought for every metre. The city was running short of food. The civilian population was terrified. And then, on September 12th, help arrived. A relief army commanded by King John III Sobieski of Poland, in alliance with the Habsburg Emperor Leopold I and various German princes, descended from the Kahlenberg hills above the city in a charge that contemporaries described as one of the most dramatic moments in European military history. Sobieski led the largest cavalry charge in European history, some 18,000 hussars and other cavalry sweeping down the hillside in formation, their lances lowered, their armour catching the afternoon light, crashing into the Ottoman lines from a direction the Grand Vizier had failed to adequately defend. The Ottoman camp collapsed. Kara Mustafa fled. The camp was abandoned with its treasures, its supplies, its administrative records, its tents. Among the things left behind were sacks of coffee beans, which the Viennese reportedly did not recognize, and which a Polish soldier familiar with Ottoman customs reportedly brewed and distributed. Whether or not this romantic story is accurate, Vienna would develop one of Europe's great coffeehouse cultures in the decades that followed. Kara Mustafa was executed by the Sultan's order in December, strangled by a silk cord and decapitated, which was the customary fate of grand viziers who lost important battles. The defeat at Vienna was not an immediate catastrophe for the empire. It still controlled enormous territory, enormous wealth, enormous military capacity. But it marked the beginning of a long, slow military retreat in Europe. The Holy League, Austria, Poland, Venice, and eventually Russia pressed their advantage. The Peace of Karlowitz in 1699 was the first time the Ottoman Empire had surrendered significant territory at a peace conference, rather than at a military defeat in the field. The Ottomans ceded most of Hungary to the Habsburgs, the Morea to Venice, Podolia to Poland. It was the first step in a process that would take 2 more centuries. The 18th century brought the Ottoman Empire into sustained conflict with a power that had not previously featured significantly in its history, Russia. Peter the Great's Russia was transforming itself at speed, building a navy, reorganizing its army along European lines, expanding southward toward the Black Sea and the warm water ports that Russian geography had always denied it. The steppe to the north of the Black Sea was Ottoman territory, or Ottoman protected territory. The Crimean Tatars, who controlled the northern shore, were Ottoman vassals. Russian expansion southward was inevitably Ottoman contraction. The wars between Russia and the Ottoman Empire across the 18th century are numerous enough to blur together in the memory, but their cumulative effect was unmistakable. In the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca in 1774, after a catastrophic war in which the Ottoman fleet was destroyed by Russian naval forces in the Aegean, Russian ships in the Aegean, a thing that would have seemed impossible a century before, the Ottomans were forced to recognize Russian independence on the northern Black Sea coast. The Crimean Tatars were declared independent of Ottoman suzerainty, a legal fiction that did not survive long before Russia annexed Crimea outright in 1783. This was something new and deeply troubling, the loss of Muslim territory to a Christian power and the failure of that loss to be reversed. It raised questions about the empire's divinely ordained mission and about the relationship between Islamic civilization and the rapidly modernizing powers of Europe. Ottoman thinkers began, haltingly, to ask what had gone wrong and what could be done. The French Revolution and its aftermath complicated everything. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, Ottoman territory technically, though the Mamluks had ruled it in practice, was a shock of a different kind. The French came not just as military conquerors, but as representatives of a new kind of civilization that brought printing presses and scientists and engineers along with its soldiers. They published Arabic newspapers and conducted geological surveys and measured the pyramids. Then they left, defeated by a combination of British naval power, Egyptian resistance, and logistical impossibility. But their brief presence had introduced ideas that could not be uninvited. The question of reform, how to modernize the empire's military, its administration, its relationship with European powers, became the central question of the 19th century. Mahmud II, who came to power in 1808, after surviving a period of extraordinary instability, was a reformer in the tradition of Peter the Great, convinced that the survival of the empire required fundamental changes to its structure, impatient with the institutions that resisted change, willing to use violence to overcome that resistance. The Janissaries were the central problem. By the early 19th century, they had become a conservative force hostile to any military innovation, capable of overthrowing sultans they disliked, economically embedded in Istanbul's commerce, and militarily much less effective than the European armies they would have to face. Every previous attempt to reform or circumvent them had ended in Janissary revolt, and the reforming sultan's downfall. Mahmud prepared carefully. He built a new-style military unit alongside the Janissaries, trained in European tactics by European instructors. When the Janissaries rebelled against this reform as expected in 1826, Mahmud was ready. He gathered the loyal forces, brought out the sacred standard of the Prophet Muhammad, a relic of enormous religious significance kept in the Topkapi treasury, and called on the population of Istanbul to defend their religion and their sultan. The Janissaries' barracks were surrounded and set on fire. Those who fled were cut down. Perhaps 6,000 Janissaries died in a single day, and an institution that had existed for nearly 5 centuries was abolished by imperial decree. Mahmud called it the auspicious incident. He then moved to reform the military, the bureaucracy, the system of provincial government, the dress code of officials, and the educational system, all within a period of 2 decades. It was an enormous project, driven by a man who understood that reform meant doing things that would have been considered impious a generation before, and who did them anyway. The Tanzimat period, from the Arabic and Ottoman word for reorganization, formally began in 1839 with the promulgation of the Hatta Sharif of Gulhan, a decree issued in the Rose Garden of the Topkapi Palace that promised equal treatment for all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion, security of person and property, regular taxation, and an end to arbitrary confiscation. It was a radical document by Ottoman standards, and like many radical documents, its implementation was uneven. But it set out a vision of the Ottoman state as a civil rather than purely religious order, and it opened the door to decades of legal reform. The Tanzimat reformers, bureaucrats and statesmen like Mustafa Reshid Pasha, Ali Pasha, and Fuad Pasha, were educated men who had spent time in European capitals, who spoke French, who read European newspapers and studied European institutions. They wanted to adapt what they admired, without simply importing it wholesale. They created new legal codes based on French models, but embedded within Islamic frameworks. They established secular schools alongside religious ones. They reformed the land registry. They extended legal protections to Christian and Jewish minorities in ways that were intended partly to satisfy European demands, and partly because they genuinely believed in the project. The empire's relationship with its non-Muslim populations, the millets, was complex and shifting. The millet system had organised the empire's religious minorities into self-governing communities, with their own courts, their own educational institutions, their own religious hierarchies. It was a form of pluralism, though not the modern kind. It was a managed pluralism in which difference was tolerated within defined boundaries, not celebrated as enriching. The reforms of the Tanzimat disturbed this system without entirely replacing it, creating new tensions as Ottoman Christians sought both the old protections of the millet and the new rights promised by Tanzimat law. Meanwhile, the empire's territorial losses continued. Greece had won independence in 1830, after a war that had attracted the passionate support of European romantics. Lord Byron died there in Missolonghi, organising the Greek cause, and the military intervention of Britain, France and Russia. Serbia was increasingly autonomous. Egypt was governed by Mehmed Ali, an Ottoman officer from Kavala, in what is now Greece, who had risen to power after Napoleon's departure, built a modern army with French help, and was expanding into Sudan and Syria with ambitions that barely bothered to disguise themselves as loyalty to the Sultan. The phrase Eastern Question was used throughout the 19th century to describe what European powers were going to do about the Ottoman Empire, specifically how they were going to manage its gradual collapse without going to war with each other over who would inherit the pieces. The Ottoman Empire had become, in the language of Tsar Nicholas I, the sick man of Europe, a phrase so widely used that it almost obscures how contested it actually was. The empire was indeed weakened, indebted, losing territory, and facing internal revolts. But it was also capable of surprising resilience, and the interests of the major European powers were sufficiently divergent that they repeatedly, paradoxically, found themselves supporting the Ottoman state's survival rather than hastening its end. Britain wanted free passage through the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits for its trade with the Black Sea. It did not want Russia to control Constantinople. It therefore propped up Ottoman power rather than allow Russian expansion to fill the vacuum. France had its own interests, financial investments in Ottoman territory, a historical connection with Catholic populations in Ottoman Syria and Lebanon, a desire for influence in North Africa. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 brought this geopolitical complexity into sharp focus. Russia invaded the Ottoman Danubian principalities, what is now Romania, on the pretext of protecting Orthodox Christian populations within the empire. The Ottomans declared war. Britain and France, alarmed at Russian expansion, joined the Ottoman side. Piedmont Sardinia sent troops for its own diplomatic reasons. It was one of the strangest coalitions in European history. Two of the great Christian powers of the West fighting alongside the Islamic Empire of the East against another Christian empire of the East. The war was fought partly in the Danubian principalities, partly in the Caucasus, and most famously in the Crimean Peninsula, where the siege of Sevastopol lasted nearly a year and killed soldiers on both sides in numbers that shocked European publics. The Light Brigade charged into Russian guns at Balaclava, a catastrophe that Tennyson turned into a poem about heroism and that military historians still discuss as an example of catastrophic miscommunication. Florence Nightingale went to the military hospitals at Scutari, across the Bosphorus from Istanbul, and found conditions so bad that she spent the rest of her life reforming military medicine. The Ottomans emerged from the war as nominal victors but were in practice deeply damaged by it. The war had been financed partly with debt to British and French banks, debt that would grow over the following decades into an obligation so overwhelming that the empire eventually had to submit to foreign financial oversight. A body called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, established in 1881, collected Ottoman tax revenues on behalf of European creditors, a humiliation that reformers and nationalists alike found intolerable. And yet the empire continued to function, to build, to produce. The railway lines that spread across Anatolia and the Arab provinces in the late 19th century, financed largely by European capital but built with Ottoman labour and servicing Ottoman trade, were genuine developments. Izmir, the great Aegean port city, grew dramatically as cotton exports from Anatolia rose to supply European textile mills. Beirut became one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the Eastern Mediterranean, a mixing point for Ottoman, French, Arab and international cultures. Istanbul itself gained a suburb, Pera, which was essentially a European city built on a hill across the Golden Horn from the Old City, full of European banks, European hotels, European-style apartment buildings, the Grand Orient Hotel, the Pera Palace Hotel that would host Agatha Christie and her private dramas. Abdul Hamid II came to the throne in 1876 and would rule until 1909, the longest reign of any Ottoman sultan in more than 2 centuries. He was a man of extraordinary complexity, a modernizer who used modern surveillance techniques, a pan-Islamist who deployed the telegraph to project spiritual authority, a paranoid autocrat who built a vast network of spies and informers, and simultaneously a man who built thousands of schools, extended the railway network across Syria and the Hijaz, reformed the legal system, and genuinely tried to find a formula for the empire's survival. He came to power in a moment of crisis. The Bulgarian uprising of 1876 had been suppressed with massacres by Ottoman irregular forces that appalled European opinion. Russia had declared war. The Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78 was a disaster. Russian forces came within sight of the minarets of Istanbul before the other European powers intervened diplomatically. The resulting Congress of Berlin in 1878 stripped the empire of most of its remaining European territory. Bulgaria became largely autonomous. Bosnia was occupied by Austria, Hungary, Romania, Serbia and Montenegro became fully independent. Cyprus was administered by Britain. Abdul Hamid's response to this crisis was, in its way, brilliant and deeply problematic. He suspended the constitution that had been promulgated in 1876, a genuine constitutional document, however imperfect, and governed as an autocrat. He moved his court out of the Topkapi Palace to the newly built Yıldız Palace complex on a hilltop above the Bosphorus, surrounded by high walls and extensive gardens, accessible through multiple guarded checkpoints. He was genuinely afraid of assassination, and with some reason, several attempts were made. He reportedly checked under his bed every night before sleeping. But from behind those walls he directed a policy of considerable sophistication. He embraced the title of Caliph, protector of all Muslims, with more enthusiasm and more organizational effort than any previous sultan had done. He sent emissaries to Muslim communities around the world. He funded the construction of the Hejaz Railway, which carried pilgrims from Damascus to Medina and brought those holy cities closer to the Ottoman centre. He corresponded with Muslim leaders in India, in Central Asia, in Africa, cultivating the idea that the Ottoman Sultan Caliph was the protector of a global Muslim community. The policy had real effects. It complicated British colonial management of Muslim India, disrupted French authority in North Africa, and gave the Ottomans a form of soft power that their declining military could not provide. But it also hardened the empire's self-understanding in ways that made it harder to accommodate the non-Muslim populations, who were still a significant portion of its subjects. The Armenian community had lived within the empire for centuries, one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, concentrated in eastern Anatolia and Istanbul. Some Armenians, influenced by European nationalist ideas and Russian encouragement, had organized politically and occasionally militarily for greater rights and eventual autonomy. Abdul Hamid's response in the 1890s was devastating. The massacres of Armenians between 1894 and 1896 killed somewhere between 80,000 and 300,000 people, the estimates varying considerably because the records were deliberately obscured. It was an act of state violence that permanently altered the relationship between the Ottoman government and its Armenian subjects, and that cast a long shadow over later history. Abdul Hamid also transformed Ottoman education. Under his reign, the number of schools in the empire, including secular secondary schools, professional schools, military academies, grew dramatically. A generation of young Ottomans was educated in institutions that taught not only Ottoman loyalism, but also European sciences, European history, and European political ideas. The contradiction was one he did not fully resolve. He educated the people who would eventually overthrow him. They called themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, though history would remember them as the Young Turks, a term that has passed into common usage to mean any group of young reformers challenging an established order. The original Young Turks were officers, bureaucrats, and intellectuals, many of them educated in the military academies Abdul Hamid had built, who organized in secret societies to restore the constitution and limit the Sultan's autocratic power. The revolution of 1908 succeeded with remarkable speed and relatively little bloodshed. Military units in Macedonia refused orders to suppress the movement. The telegraph, Abdul Hamid's own tool, carried the news of provincial support faster than he could respond. He restored the constitution. He appeared on balconies to receive the cheers of crowds who had gathered spontaneously and genuinely believed that a new era had begun. The initial mood was extraordinary. Representatives of all the empire's communities, Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Bulgarians, Jews, embraced in Istanbul's streets. Newspapers blossomed. Political parties formed overnight. People talked publicly about things they had only whispered privately for 30 years. A French journalist in Istanbul described the city as intoxicated. The intoxication did not last. The empire was still encircled by threats, still financially weakened, still governed by institutions that the revolution had changed at the top but not at the base. In 1909, a counter-revolution, backed partly by religious conservatives, partly by old court networks, briefly restored Abdul Hamid's personal rule and had to be reversed by a military march on Istanbul from Macedonia. Abdul Hamid was deposed, sent into exile in Salonika, and replaced by his brother Mehmed V, who was a constitutional monarch in the fullest sense, which meant in the circumstances largely a figurehead. The years from 1908 to 1914 were years of catastrophic loss. Italy invaded Libya in 1911, the last Ottoman territory in Africa, and the empire could not effectively respond. The First Balkan War in 1912 brought Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro into coalition against the Ottomans and drove the empire out of virtually all its remaining European territory in a matter of months. A disaster so swift and so humiliating that it caused a further radicalization of the Cup leadership. The Second Balkan War in 1913, among the Balkan allies themselves, allowed the Ottomans to retake Edirne, but the overall territorial position remained devastating. The men who came to dominate the CUP in this period, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, the three pashas who effectively governed the empire from 1913 onward, were hardened by these losses and convinced that the empire's survival required a new, more explicitly Turkish nationalism and a more ruthless approach to internal threats. They were able, energetic, and in some respects visionary. They were also capable of terrible decisions and terrible acts. When the guns of August 1914 began firing in Europe, the Ottoman Empire found itself in an extraordinarily delicate position. There were those within the Cup who argued for neutrality. The empire was exhausted, financially broken, its military still recovering from the Balkan Wars, its government barely functioning after years of crisis. Neutrality would allow recovery and perhaps the recovery of some losses through diplomacy. But Enver Pasha had other ideas. He had spent time in Berlin as a military attaché, admired German military organisation and efficiency, and believed that the German war machine was going to win the European war quickly and comprehensively. Aligning with the victors seemed to him not merely logical but possibly the only road to salvation, to the recovery of Balkan territory, to the defeat of Russia in the Caucasus, and the reunification of the Turkic peoples of Central Asia under Ottoman leadership. He dreamed large. The Ottoman Empire entered the war in November 1914 on the side of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria. The Ottoman Navy, nominally under German officers, bombarded Russian Black Sea ports. The British and French, who had been trying to keep the Ottomans neutral, declared war. The resulting campaigns unfolded on multiple fronts simultaneously. In the Caucasus, Enver Pasha led an offensive in the winter of 1914-15 toward the Russian-held city of Sarıkamış, in mountains where temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. The attack was disastrously conceived and disastrously executed. The Third Ottoman Army lost perhaps 80% of its men to combat frostbite and disease. It was one of the worst military catastrophes of the war. In the Dardanelles, a British and French naval force attempted in February and March of 1915 to force their way through the straits and take Istanbul. They failed. Mines in the water, guns on the shore, and Ottoman resistance were too much. The subsequent land campaign at Gallipoli, where Allied troops landed in April 1915 on the peninsula, became one of the bloodiest and most bitterly contested operations of the entire war. For 9 months, Anzac, British, French, and other Allied troops fought in conditions of extraordinary difficulty against Ottoman defenders who were fighting, in the most literal sense, for the survival of their capital city. Mustafa Kemal, an Ottoman officer who had become the most important figure in Turkish history, commanded at Gallipoli with a relentlessness that became legendary. The Allies evacuated in December 1915 and January 1916, having achieved nothing but the deaths of tens of thousands on both sides. In Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq, British forces advancing from Basra toward Baghdad were surrounded and captured at the Siege of Kut in 1916, the largest surrender of British-led forces since the American Revolution. It was humiliation that the British eventually avenged when a renewed offensive captured Baghdad in 1917 and reached Mosul by 1918. In the Arab provinces, the British officer T.E. Lawrence worked alongside Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who launched the Arab Revolt in 1916, with promises of British support for an independent Arab kingdom. The revolt disrupted Ottoman communications and supply lines in the Hijaz and eventually spread northward. The fall of Jerusalem to British forces in December 1917 was treated in Britain as a moment of profound historical significance. The city had been under Islamic rule, with one brief Crusader interruption since 1187. And across all of this, in eastern Anatolia, occurred the event that would cast the longest shadow over the 20th century and beyond. Chapter 21, 1915. It is impossible to write a history of the Ottoman Empire without addressing what happened to the Armenian population in 1915 and the years that followed. It is also, genuinely, one of the most contested events in modern historiography, not because the deaths are disputed, but because the intent, the scale, and the appropriate category for what occurred remain subjects of enormous political sensitivity and considerable scholarly debate. What is not disputed? Beginning in spring 1915, the Ottoman government ordered the deportation of Armenian populations from eastern Anatolia. Armenians were marched from their villages and cities toward the Syrian desert, across terrain that offered them no protection from heat, starvation, or attack. Hundreds of thousands, the estimates range from 600,000 to more than 1 million, with some placing it higher, died in the deportations or were killed by Ottoman soldiers, Kurdish irregular forces, or common criminals who fell upon the convoys. The Armenian community in Anatolia, which had existed there for more than 2,000 years, was largely destroyed. Communities that had survived the Byzantine and Roman and Hellenistic and Assyrian empires, that had maintained their language and their Christian faith through 6 centuries of Ottoman rule, ceased to exist in their ancestral homeland within the space of a few years. The scholarly debate centres on the question of intent. The Ottoman government, and later the Turkish government that succeeded it, argued that the deportations were a security measure in wartime, that Armenians in eastern Anatolia had collaborated with advancing Russian armies, that the deportations were militarily necessary, that the deaths, though terrible, were the result of wartime conditions rather than systematic extermination. Historians who argue for genocide point to the evidence of centrally organised killing, the targeting of Armenian populations far from any military front, the systematic destruction of a people rather than simply the removal of a security threat. The weight of the scholarly consensus in most countries and most universities holds that what occurred was genocide. Turkey continues to dispute that characterization, and the dispute has shaped diplomacy, educational curricula, and political relationships across the decades. What is certain is that the events of 1915 mark one of the deepest wounds in the history of the dying empire, and one of the most consequential for what came after, for the shape of modern Turkey, for the memory of the Armenian diaspora scattered across the world, for the still unresolved question of historical acknowledgement and its relationship to reconciliation. By 1917 and 1918, the Ottoman position was collapsing on multiple fronts. The German alliance was providing equipment and officers and occasional tactical assistance, but it could not compensate for the fundamental exhaustion of a society that had been at war almost continuously since 1911. Harvests had failed. The population of Syria and Lebanon had suffered a famine, partly caused by the war, partly by locust plagues, partly by requisitions of food by the Ottoman military, that killed perhaps 500,000 people. Animals had been taken for military use. Young men had been conscripted until there were none left to conscript. The British offensive from Egypt under General Allenby moved through Palestine and Syria with gathering speed. Damascus fell in October 1918. Ottoman forces in the Arab provinces had essentially ceased to function as a coherent military entity. The armistice signed on October 30th, 1918, aboard the British warship Agamemnon in the harbour of Mudros, on the Greek island of Lemnos, ended the Ottoman participation in the First World War. It was a devastating document. The straits were to be open to Allied warships. The Ottoman armies were to be demobilised. The Allies reserved the right to occupy any point they judged to be a security threat. The 3 pashas, Enver Talat and Cemal, fled the country on a German submarine. They were later assassinated, each of them, by Armenian avengers organised under a secret operation called Nemesis. Talat Pasha was shot in a Berlin street in 1921. Cemal Pasha was shot in Tiflis in 1922. Enver Pasha died in 1922 in what is now Tajikistan, shot from his horse during an engagement with Red Army troops while leading a Basmachi resistance movement. The Allied powers occupied Istanbul. The city that had been the Ottoman capital for nearly 5 centuries had foreign soldiers patrolling its streets, foreign warships in its harbour, foreign officers requisitioning its buildings. Sultan Mehmed VI collaborated with the occupation and signed the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which would have reduced the Ottoman state to a small rump in central Anatolia, with independent Armenia in the east, an autonomous Kurdistan in the southeast, a Greek zone of influence around Izmir, and Istanbul itself under international control. It was the end that most Europeans assumed had finally arrived. The sick man had died, and the inheritance was being divided. But in the mountains of central Anatolia, something was happening that the peacemakers in Paris had not adequately anticipated. Mustafa Kemal was 40 years old in 1919. He had been, by any measure, one of the most capable military officers the Ottoman Empire had produced in a generation. The defender of Gallipoli, an important commander in the Caucasus and Syria, a man with a reputation for competence and a willingness to tell his superiors when they were wrong. He had opposed the entry into the First World War. He had argued against the Gallipoli offensive while simultaneously defending it with extraordinary skill once it was underway. He was a difficult man who was usually right. He landed in the Black Sea port of Samsun in May 1919, sent by the Sultan's government ostensibly to supervise the demobilization of forces in Anatolia. Instead, he immediately began organizing resistance. The Greek army had landed at Izmir on May 15, 1919, under the terms of the Sèvres negotiations. The landing was accompanied by violence against the Turkish population of the city. News of this spread quickly, and the effect on Anatolian sentiment, already strained by years of war and foreign presence, was electric. It was one thing for the great powers to impose a peace treaty at a conference. It was another to see foreign soldiers occupying Anatolian cities. Kemal convened congresses, first at Erzurum and then at Sivas, building a political organization from the remnants of Ottoman military and civil authority still functioning in Anatolia. He broke with the Sultan's government, which had declared him a rebel, and established a rival government, the Grand National Assembly, which first met in Ankara in April 1920 in the Anatolian interior. What followed was a war for national survival that the Turks call the War of Independence, fought simultaneously against the Greeks in the west, Armenian forces in the east, French forces in the south, and the political authority of the Sultan Caliph in Istanbul. It was an extraordinarily complex military and political challenge, and Kemal met it with a combination of military genius, political calculation, and sheer force of personality that remains, in Turkish national memory, one of the great moments of human achievement. The Greek advance into Anatolia pushed deep inland, nearly reaching Ankara. At the Battle of Sakarya in August to September 1921, fought on a river barely 80 kilometers from Ankara, Kemal's forces stopped the Greek advance in a battle that lasted 22 days, the longest pitched battle of the entire Turkish-Greek War, and then reversed it. The following year, a Turkish counteroffensive shattered the Greek lines, and the Greek army retreated toward Izmir in conditions that became catastrophic. Izmir was burned in September 1922, in events still disputed between Turkish and Greek historiography regarding responsibility, and the Greek and Armenian populations of the city, hundreds of thousands of people fled by sea, crowding the quays, climbing into boats, leaving behind a city that had been cosmopolitan for 3,000 years. The subsequent population exchange between Greece and Turkey, negotiated at the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, was a humanitarian operation of enormous scale and almost inconceivable individual tragedy. Approximately 1.2 million Greeks were expelled from Turkey, or chose to leave, and approximately 400,000 Muslims were expelled from Greece. Communities that had existed for centuries in their ancestral places, Greek Orthodox families in Cappadocia who spoke Turkish as their first language, Muslim families in Macedonia who had lived there for 300 years, were uprooted and replanted in places they had never seen. The Ottoman Empire formally ended on November 1st, 1922, when the Grand National Assembly abolished the Sultanate. Mehmed VI fled the country on a British warship. The Caliphate was briefly separated from the Sultanate and given to a cousin, Abdulmecid II, but that too was abolished in March 1924. The last caliph left Istanbul quietly, carrying his paintings and his books, and went into exile in France. The Republic of Turkey was proclaimed on October 29, 1923, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. He would take the surname Ataturk, Father of the Turks, by law in 1934. The Ottoman dynasty, which had ruled for 6¼ centuries, was over. Endings are rarely as clean as the documents that declare them. The Ottoman Empire officially ended in 1922, but everything it had built and everything it had shaped continued existing. The cities, the roads, the legal traditions, the architectural monuments, the religious institutions, the social patterns, the languages shaped by centuries of Ottoman influence. The inheritance was enormous and complicated and present in daily life in ways that a generation preoccupied with building something new tried hard to ignore and could not entirely escape. In Turkey, Ataturk's reforms attempted a thorough transformation. The Arabic script in which Ottoman Turkish had been written for centuries was replaced with a Latin alphabet in 1928, in a change so abrupt that overnight the entire literate population found itself unable to read the books in its own libraries. The religious schools, madris, were closed or converted to secular use. The Sufi orders, the dervish brotherhoods that had been part of the fabric of Ottoman social life since the beginning, were abolished. The fez, that distinctive hat that had itself once been a modernizing reform, was banned in favor of European-style hats. The legal system was replaced wholesale, with codes adapted from Switzerland, Italy and Germany. These reforms were not simply imposed but were accompanied by a massive effort at popular education, public persuasion, and what we might now call cultural revolution. Ataturk himself travelled across Turkey giving lectures on the new alphabet. Schools were built in villages that had never had them. A new historical narrative was constructed that emphasized the pre-Islamic Turkish heritage, located the origins of civilization in Central Asia among the ancient Turks, and treated the Ottoman period with considerable ambivalence. Beyond Turkey, the Ottoman inheritance was distributed unequally across a broad geography. The Arab provinces, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan, Lebanon, were divided under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret arrangement between Britain and France negotiated in 1916 that drew borders with rulers and lines on maps that paid more attention to colonial interest than to the communities who actually lived on the ground. The borders they drew, sometimes straight lines crossing desert, sometimes following rivers or mountain ridges with or without regard for the people on either side, created the modern states of the Middle East in forms that have proved both surprisingly durable and perpetually contested. Iraq combined the three former Ottoman provinces of Mosul, Baghdad and Basra into a single state that contained Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, Kurds, Turkmens, Assyrian Christians and other communities under the rule first of a British mandate and then of a Hashemite monarchy imported from the Hijaz. The internal tensions of this arrangement have never fully resolved. Palestine became a British mandate territory into which Jewish immigration was permitted under the Balfour Declaration of 1917. The collision between Jewish immigration and Arab-Palestinian population produced conflicts whose reverberations are still felt today. Lebanon, carved out of Greater Syria to create a state where Christians would be in the majority, developed a constitution so finely balanced among its religious communities that it built political paralysis into its foundations. These are not simply Ottoman legacies. They're also the legacies of European colonialism and of the violent disruptions of the First World War. But they sit on a foundation that the Ottomans built, and understanding the Ottoman period is essential to understanding why these territories have the shape they do. Throughout 6 centuries, the Ottoman sultans were the face and the will of the empire, not always in practice its most powerful actors, but always its symbolic centre, its legitimating source, its most visible personification. They were an extraordinarily varied collection of human beings. Selim I was fierce, ruthless, and intellectually serious, a man who read philosophy between campaigns and wrote elegant Persian poetry. Suleiman the Magnificent was statesmanlike and genuinely cultured, capable of deep personal loyalty and sudden terrible cruelty. His son Selim II, called the Sot by European chroniclers and the Blonde by Ottoman ones, spent much of his reign in the palace, while his great vizier Sultan Mehmed Pasha actually ran the empire, and Sultan ran it well, which tells you something about the institutional strength that made Ottoman governance resilient against weak sultans. Murad III, who succeeded Selim II, was remarkable mainly for the extraordinary number of his children. He had reportedly more than 100 by something like 20 concubines, a fertility that raised obvious questions about how he found time for governance. Mehmed III, who succeeded him, had his 19 brothers strangled at his accession in 1595, the largest single act of fratricide in Ottoman history, and then reportedly watched from a window as their funeral procession passed below. Ahmed I, who came to the throne in 1603 at age 13, broke the practice of fratricide. He was the first sultan to spare his brothers. This was a humane impulse, but it created a new problem. If brothers were not killed, they were potential threats. The solution was to confine them in apartments within the palace, called the cafes, the cage, where they lived lives of enforced idleness, neither executed nor allowed to participate in governance. Sultans who emerged from the cafes after long confinements sometimes emerged psychologically damaged, unprepared for rule, having spent their most formative years in a gilded but suffocating imprisonment. Ibrahim I, who ruled from 1640 to 1648, had spent 22 years in the cafes before becoming sultan. He was deeply unstable, brilliant at times, paranoid and violent at others, and his reign was marked by erratic behaviour that eventually led to his deposition and death by strangulation, the first sultan killed by his own officials since the early days of the dynasty. The particular cruelty he was accused of, having 280 women of the harem drowned in the Bosphorus for reasons that were never entirely clear, may be exaggerated in the sources, but something about his story has lodged in Ottoman historiography as a symbol of institutional dysfunction at its worst. Suleiman II spent 39 years in the cafes before becoming sultan at 50 years old. When he came out, he reportedly wept and asked to be taken back. He was afraid of the world outside. Yet the same institution could also produce Mustafa II, who was a competent military leader, Mahmud I, who was a genuine patron of the arts, or Mahmud II, who was perhaps the most energetically reforming sultan since Suleiman the Magnificent. The Ottoman institution of the Sultanate was, like all human institutions, capable of containing both the best and worst of what people can be. Ottoman women's history requires deliberate attention, because the official historical record was kept largely by men about men, and the women who shaped the empire often did so through channels that left fewer traces in the archive. We have already met Hurrem Sultan, whose love for Suleiman and whose political intelligence made her one of the most consequential figures of the 16th century. She was not unique, though she was exceptional. Hurrem Sultan was, arguably, even more powerful for a longer period. Born probably in the 1590s, of uncertain origin, possibly Greek, possibly Bosnian, she became a favourite of Ahmed I and bore him several sons. When Ahmed died in 1617, 2 of those sons eventually became sultan, and Hurrem served as regent for each of them in turn. Her regency for Murad IV who was 11 when he became sultan, lasted from 1623 to 1632. Her regency for Ibrahim I was shorter and more complicated. Her regency for Mehmed IV, her grandson, whom she helped place on the throne in 1648 after engineering Ibrahim's deposition, was curtailed when her daughter-in-law, Turhan Hatik Sultan, Mehmed's mother, moved against her in 1651. Kösem was 70 years old when the Janissaries, acting with Turhan Hatita's support, broke into her apartments in the harem and strangled her. She had dominated the Ottoman government for more than 30 years. The empire she left was not the same empire she had found. Turhan Hatits, who effectively ruled as a regent after Kösem's death, was a builder of considerable ambition. She commissioned the restoration and completion of the Yeni Cami, the new mosque on the Golden Horn waterfront, a project that had been started 50 years earlier and abandoned. Completed in 1663, it stands today at one of the most visible spots in Istanbul, its twin minarets framing the Galata Bridge. These women navigated a system that officially excluded them from formal power, but that gave them, through the matrilineal structures of palace society, through their sons and grandsons and protégés, through networks of obligation and information and patronage, substantial real authority. They were constrained in ways we would now recognize as profoundly unjust. They were also, within those constraints, formidably capable. Beyond the palace, women in Ottoman society led lives that were shaped by religion, custom, class and ethnicity in complex combination. Peasant women worked the fields alongside men and did not observe the kind of seclusion that urban upper-class women were expected to maintain. Women in the cities participated in the economy. There are records of women owning shops, lending money, taking cases to the Islamic law courts to defend property rights, inheriting and bequeathing wealth. The courts were, in many respects, more accessible to Ottoman women than the courts of contemporaneous European societies. Women pilgrims went to Mecca. Women poets wrote verse, not many, but some, and those who did were respected within literary circles. Women scholars occasionally taught. The boundaries were real and restrictive, but they were not, as the popular image sometimes suggests, absolute. The Ottoman Empire was never economically self-contained. It was from the beginning a commercial civilization as much as a military or religious one, and its geography made it the pivot of the world's most important trade routes. The ancient Silk Road did not die with the rise of Ottoman power, it transformed. Caravans still moved from Persia and Central Asia into Anatolia and the Levant. The spice trade still came up from the Red Sea ports into Alexandria and Aleppo and Beirut, and then scattered westward into Europe. The Black Sea trade, grain, fish, timber, furs from the Russian steppe, flowed through the Bosphorus into the Mediterranean, and then onto Venice and Genoa and Barcelona. Aleppo deserves particular attention as a commercial capital. It sat at the junction of trade routes coming from Persia, from Mesopotamia, from the Gulf, from Egypt, from the Mediterranean coast. Its great covered market, the souk, was one of the longest in the world, stretching for miles under vaulted stone ceilings that kept it cool in summer. Venetian and English and French merchants established their own trading houses, called khans or fondaks, within the city, and maintained permanent presences there. The English Levant Company, chartered in 1581, made much of its enormous profit from the Aleppo trade. Aleppo was a city where you could hear Arabic, Turkish, Persian, Italian, French, Armenian, Syriac, Greek, and Hebrew, spoken within a few minutes' walk. The Ottoman government's relationship with trade was complex. It taxed merchants heavily, customs duties, market taxes, transportation fees, and these revenues were an important part of the imperial budget. But it also understood that trade required infrastructure, safe roads, maintained caravanserais, trustworthy weights and measures, courts that could adjudicate commercial disputes. The empire built caravanserais, roadside inns where caravans could water their animals, repair their loads, and sleep safely. Across its territory, some of them structures of considerable architectural ambition, the Jewish commercial networks deserve particular notice. After the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, large communities settled in Ottoman cities, in Salonika, which became a predominantly Jewish city for centuries, in Istanbul, in Izmir, in Saft in Palestine, in Cairo. They brought with them connections to Spanish and Portuguese markets, knowledge of European commercial practices, family networks that spanned continents. Ottoman sultans, beginning with Bayezid II, who reportedly welcomed the Spanish exiles by saying that Ferdinand of Spain had impoverished himself and enriched the Ottomans, understood the value of this expertise. The relationship was not without tension. There were periods of restriction and disadvantage, but for centuries, Ottoman Jews operated commercial networks that connected the empire's products to European markets with a sophistication that benefited both sides. The wool of Salonika's Jewish weavers clothed much of the Ottoman army at various points. The economy began to strain in the 18th and especially the 19th centuries, as European manufacturing expanded and its products became cheap enough to undercut Ottoman artisans. Greek textiles, French cotton, British iron goods entered Ottoman markets and competed successfully with local production. The guilds that had maintained Ottoman craftsmanship began to decline. The empire shifted toward being primarily a provider of raw materials, cotton, silk, mohair, opium, tobacco, to European industry, while European finished goods flowed in the other direction. It was the colonial economic relationship without the formal colonial status, and it hollowed out parts of the Ottoman artisanal economy with considerable thoroughness. Ottoman literary culture was multilingual from the beginning. The court spoke and wrote in Ottoman Turkish, a language rich with Arabic and Persian vocabulary, written in Arabic script, distinct in its grammar and its music from any single parent language. Persian was the language of high culture and serious poetry. Arabic was the language of religion, law, and scholarship. And below this formal superstructure, dozens of other languages were spoken, written in various scripts and produced their own literatures: Greek, Armenian, Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish of the Sephardic communities, Bulgarian, Serbian, Arabic dialects, Kurdish. The divan tradition, the classical Ottoman poetry tradition, produced figures of genuine greatness. Fuzuli, who lived in the 16th century and wrote in Ottoman, Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, created verses about love and mysticism that remain among the most beautiful in any of those languages. His Layla and Meknun, an Ottoman retelling of the Persian romance, is a sustained exploration of love as a path toward divine understanding, using the story of two lovers separated by convention and circumstance as a meditation on the soul's yearning for God. Baki, who lived during Suleiman's reign and was considered in his own time the greatest Ottoman poet, wrote an elegy for Suleiman after his death in 1566 that became one of the most celebrated poems in the language. Its image of the Sultan as a kind of divine ruler whose absence leaves the world diminished is both conventional in its form and genuinely moving in its execution. Nedim, who wrote in the early 18th century, brought a different quality to Ottoman poetry, lighter, more sensuous, more directly about the pleasures of the world. He wrote about the gardens along the Bosphorus where the wealthy of Istanbul spent their leisured afternoons, about the tulips that bloomed there in profusion during what became known as the Tulip Era, a period of relative peace and remarkable cultural flowering under Ahmed III in the 1710s and 1720s. The tulip, whose name comes from the Turkish word for turban, had been beloved in Ottoman culture for centuries and was cultivated in hundreds of varieties. During this period it became the organizing symbol of a sophisticated pleasure culture that seemed, to later and more sober eyes, to represent Ottoman society playing while Rome burned. The shadow literature, the Karagöz shadow puppet theatre, was something else entirely, a popular art form that bypassed the courtly tradition altogether. Karagöz and Hasivat, the two central characters, were comic archetypes. Karagöz, the vulgar, earthy, illiterate common man, Hasivat, the pretentious, educated pedant, whose interactions were a vehicle for satire, wordplay, off-colour jokes, and social commentary that the formal literary tradition would never have contained. The performances happened at night, by the light of an oil lamp with translucent leather puppets casting shadows on a white screen. The stories included topical humour about current events and eternal humour about the human condition. The oral tradition was also fundamental. Travelling storytellers, meddahs, performed in coffee houses and public squares, telling long serialised stories that kept audiences returning night after night. The epic tales of folk heroes, Korolu, the outlaw rider, Nasreddin Hoca, the wise fool whose jokes encoded genuine philosophical observations, circulated orally for centuries before being written down. Nasreddin Hoca deserves particular attention because his stories are still told, still funny, still resonant. He is depicted as a mullah, a religious figure, but one who subverts religious pomposity at every turn. A typical story. Someone asks Nasreddin which direction Mecca is. He points. The questioner says that he was pointing west yesterday. Nasreddin says, "Yes, but I've travelled since then." The stories work simultaneously as comedy and as philosophy, as social commentary and as Sufi teaching, and they have proven so durable that they have travelled far beyond their Ottoman origins. The Ottoman Empire was an Islamic state. An Islamic practice structured its public institutions, its legal system, its calendar, its architecture, and itself, understanding in ways that were fundamental. And yet the Islam of the Ottoman Empire was neither monolithic nor simple. The Sunni Islam that the Ottomans officially practiced existed in multiple legal schools. The Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali schools each interpreted Islamic law somewhat differently, and the Ottomans favoured the Hanafi school without entirely suppressing the others. The chief religious official of the Shaykhul Islam served as the empire's highest religious authority and was consulted on matters of law and legitimacy, issuing fatwas, legal opinions, that could authorise or prohibit acts of state. But alongside this official structure, the Sufi orders operated with enormous cultural influence. The Mevlevi order, founded by the followers of Rumi and Konya, was the most aristocratic and intellectual, their Sima ceremony. The spinning dance of the whirling dervishes was performed by educated men as a form of meditative spiritual practice. The Bektashi order had a complex relationship with the empire's military. The Janissaries considered themselves devotees of the Bektashi path, and the order's syncretistic, heterodox tendencies suited men who lived in the borderlands between faiths. The Naqshbendi, the Qadiri, the Halveti, and dozens of other orders each had their own techies, lodge houses, their own chains of masters and disciples, their own spiritual practices. The relationship between official Islam and Sufi practice was often tense and sometimes explosive. Authorities periodically closed coffee houses and lodge houses and prohibited certain types of devotional music as innovations contrary to proper Islamic practice. The Sufis continued because their hold on popular devotion was too strong to suppress, and because many sultans and officials were themselves members of Sufi orders. Christianity existed within the empire in multiple forms. Greek Orthodox Christianity was the most numerous. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch, who resided in Constantinople, was recognized by the Ottomans as the head of the Rum millet, the community of Orthodox Christians. The Armenian Apostolic Church had its own patriarch and its own millet. The Syrian, Coptic, and Ethiopian Orthodox churches had their communities. The Catholic and Protestant communities grew more significant in the 19th century as European missionary activity increased. Judaism maintained its communities and its legal structure under the millet system. The chief rabbi of Istanbul, the Hambashi, was recognized as the head of the Jewish millet. Yeshivot, Jewish academies, operated in Salonika, Istanbul, Saft, and other cities. The great legal codes of Joseph Caro, the Sultan Arush, still authoritative in Orthodox Judaism today, were composed in Safed in the 16th century within the Ottoman Empire, drawing on the rich community of Jewish scholars gathered there. What made the Ottoman approach to religious diversity distinctive was not tolerance in the modern sense. The millets operated within a hierarchy that placed Sunni Muslim practice at the top and the others beneath it, in theory if not always in practice. What it was a managed coexistence, a recognition that the empire's diversity was a fact that had to be accommodated, and the development of legal and institutional structures for doing so. It was imperfect, often unfair, occasionally brutal, and also, measured against the alternatives available to religious minorities in most of contemporary Europe, considerably more livable than the alternatives. 600 years end not with a single moment, but with a gradual dimming, like a room growing dark as the sun sets, and you're too engaged in conversation to notice, until you realize you can no longer quite see the faces of the people across from you. The Ottoman Empire faded from the world in 1922, and the world it left behind was already, in many fundamental ways, the world we live in. The borders of the modern Middle East, drawn largely by the British and French in the years immediately after the First World War, sometimes following Ottoman, provincial boundaries and sometimes cutting across them with indifference, remain the borders on the maps today, though they are disputed and crossed and contested in ways that suggest they were never entirely real. Istanbul is a city of 16 or 17 million people now, the largest city in Europe by population, and it carries its Ottoman past the way a very old tree carries its inner rings, invisible from the outside but present in the structure of everything. The Hagia Sophia, which Mehmed the Conqueror converted to a mosque in 1453, was converted to a museum in 1934 by Ataturk, and converted back to a mosque by presidential decree in 2020. The mosaics of Byzantine emperors and empresses, uncovered during the museum years, have been covered again by curtains during prayer times. The building is still there, still impossible, still holding the weight of 15 centuries of history in its dome. The Suleiman Mosque still stands on its hill. The Grand Bazaar still operates, though selling mobile phone cases and tourist souvenirs alongside carpets and spices. The Topkapi Palace is a museum visited by millions of people each year who walk through the courtyards where janissaries once drilled and where sultans once moved in procession. In the Arab world, the Ottoman period is remembered differently in different places. In some countries, it is remembered as foreign occupation, a Turkish overlordship imposed on Arab peoples. In others, it is remembered more ambivalently as a period of order and prosperity compared with what came before and after. The scholarship is ongoing, the political valences are complicated, and the memory is alive in ways that historical periods that are truly over are not. In the Balkans, the Ottoman centuries are remembered as a yoke, and also, increasingly among some historians and communities, as something more complicated, a period that shaped local cultures profoundly, that left architectural monuments still standing, that created patterns of pluralism, however imperfect, that the nationalist projects of the 19th and 20th centuries deliberately destroyed. The question of how to remember the Ottoman Balkans without either romanticizing it or reducing it to pure oppression is one that historians and politicians continue to argue about. The Ottomans left behind not just borders and buildings, but words. The Turkish influence on Balkan languages is profound. Bulgarian, Romanian, Albanian, Greek, Bosnian all contain thousands of words borrowed from Ottoman Turkish, often for the most basic everyday things. Words for time, for food, for household objects, for administrative concepts. The Arabic and Persian words that Ottoman Turkish absorbed are present in modern Turkish, even after the language reforms that tried to replace them with pure Turkic equivalents. The replacements are there on official forms, but the old words live on in speech. The story of the Ottoman Empire is, in one sense, the story of 6 centuries of extraordinary human energy, of builders and poets and warriors and merchants and administrators and mothers and rebels and scholars and dervishes, all living within a structure that was vast enough to contain them and rigid enough to eventually be unable to change as fast as the world demanded. In another sense, it is a story that is not over at all, that continues in the cities and borders and memories and arguments that it left behind, in the daily prayers in the mosques it built, in the tiles it made that still gleam their impossible blue in museum cases around the world. We have travelled far tonight. We began in the wild northwest of Anatolia, where a small band of horsemen grazed their flocks in the Byzantine borderlands, and their chieftain dreamed of trees that covered the world. We watched that dream become a state, the state become an empire, the empire reach across 3 continents and 6 centuries, and touch the lives of hundreds of millions of people in ways that still echo. We sat for a moment in Suleiman's library as the evening prayer call drifted up from the courtyard below. We stood at the walls of Constantinople in the grey morning of May 1453 and heard the sound of the cannon reverberate across the water. We drank coffee in an Istanbul coffeehouse in the 16th century, where the smoke of the fire mixed with the smell of the roasting beans and the sound of a story being told in the corner, a story that would last all night. We walked through the grand bazaar when it was new, when its stone vault still held the smell of fresh mortar, and the merchants were only beginning to learn its geography. We rode with caravans out of Aleppo toward Persia, the camels swaying in that particular rhythm that becomes, after long exposure, the rhythm of thought. We sat in the coulier as the soup kitchen prepared its evening meal, and the poor gathered in the courtyard in the winter dusk. We watched the janissaries drill in their barracks and the architects plan their mosques, and the women of the harem move through their complex world of beauty and confinement and power. We listened to Fuzuli's verses about love that transcends all ordinary understanding. We laughed at Nasreddin Hoka's jokes about pointing toward a Mecca that moves whenever you travel. We watched the empire strain and crack under the pressures of a world that was changing too fast, of European power that was growing too strong, of internal contradictions that could not be finally resolved. We saw the 3 pashas flee into the night and the last caliph carry his paintings onto a train at Istanbul station, headed for a Europe that would receive him with polite indifference. And we watched a man stand in a schoolroom in Ankara and teach a new alphabet to people who had never imagined needing one, and understand that the ending of one thing is always, always the beginning of something else. The night is deep now. The Bosphorus, if you could see it, would be dark and still, with just the lights of the opposite shore reflected in the water like stars that have fallen and found a second home. 6 centuries is a long time to hold in the mind. But history is not really about holding times and dates. It is about understanding that every place you have ever stood was stood on before by someone with a life as complicated and as real as yours. That every city you have walked through was built by someone who wanted something. Safety, beauty, posterity, trade, God, and built it as well as they could and watched it change and was changed by it in turn. The Ottoman Empire was made of people, millions of them, across centuries. People who were afraid of the dark and loved their children and got headaches and argued about money and looked up at the night sky and wondered what it meant. People who woke before dawn in Istanbul to hear the call to prayer echo across the water and found it beautiful, and people who resented the empire's power and dreamed of something different. Their stories are in the stones of Istanbul, in the archives of Istanbul and Cairo and Vienna and Venice and Athens and Jerusalem, in the genes of millions of people across 3 continents who carry in their bodies and their languages traces of this world that lasted 6 centuries and then was gone. Rest now. Let the images settle. Let the caravans find their caravanserai for the night and the merchants close their stalls and the last call to prayer drift up from the last minaret and dissolve into the enormous quiet sky above the Bosphorus. The empire sleeps, and so may you.